Hello and welcome to Between the Rows. I'm Ed White, your host this week. Today we'll hear about how some stories in newspapers and magazines happen not because of an event or incident, or because people are talking about it, but because a journalist sees something they think the reader would like to know about, so they pursue it to see what they can find.
It's more a case of an individual journalist would come up with an idea and say, I've kind of noticed this phenomenon going on in the world. Maybe I should look into this in more detail.
We'll get a late winter markets update from Glacier Markets Farm.
Canola prices are very high. Most other grains and oilseeds are also seeing a fair bit of strength right now. So it's coming into the end of the winter season with a lot of strength in most commodities right now.
But first, a word from our sponsor.
Your soil has a unique story. At Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, we get that. Start using precise nutrient information to get optimal crop performance. Try our variable rate program risk-free today. Visit decisivefarming.com. Conditions apply.
Now, first up on the show, how's your butter? If you leave it out at room temperature, does it become soft and spreadable, or does it remain as hard as it was in the fridge? Recently, and oddly, this has become a national discussion amongst home cooks and bakers, and a bewildering headache for the dairy industry. For some perspective on this, let's turn to a farm media journalist who has been covering this issue. And now I welcome FarmTerrio editor John Grieg to the program. Hi, John, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Ed. Thanks.
So, John, recently you spoke to people across the country about the hard butter issue. Could you tell our listeners who maybe didn't know about that what you did on Friday?
Well, CBC runs what they call CBC syndication, where they set up a guest to talk to morning shows and afternoon shows, if that's what works for them, across the country. So I spoke to 11 different morning shows, right from Cape Breton to Victoria to Iqaluit, and several places in between, which was interesting and really showed how much interest there is in this issue.
Yeah, I got to say, I have never received so many letters as I did I've just done a couple of sort of smallish stories on this, and I have gotten dozens and dozens of emails from like home cooks, all like I don't get any emails about like health concerns or worry about palm oil. They're all worried about, why they think their butter is hard. But what strikes me with this issue is there's great interest in this, but we really know very little about it. Like we don't know how widespread it is. I just thought, what's your take as a guy who's been following this on, what we don't know about this whole question that's arisen about hard butter?
Yeah, and I think so. I've cautioned some people that the use of palm fat and dairy rations varies dramatically. It varies by time of year. It varies by region across the country. Some countries need more, supplemented energy than other parts of the country, just based on the amount of energy in forages. So, and then it can vary by the market demands. It can vary by how warm the summer is. So to blanket say all the butter is harder, I don't think you can point to the palm fat as that blanket. So, but it could be a contributing issue at certain times of the year for sure. But so that's the that's and we just don't know the answer to that. I think how variable is it? What's the rate of impact on butter, and how much of this change in butter hardness is perception versus reality. So I'm hoping there's some butter around from 20 years ago that can be checked. So and we do know that adding fatty acids to dairy diets can have effect on the end product. That's how we produced omega-3 enriched milk for quite a while. Is we fed feed that was enriched in omega-3 fatty acids, and it came out the other end. So and anybody who's spent a lot of time with cows and dairy products, the milk changes over the year. It's a biologically produced product, so so there's variability in the product.
And it just strikes me as there's so much we don't know about this story. It's getting talked about a lot. A lot of people, are saying they've seen changes to the consistency of their butter and it's harder. There's lots of other people that say they haven't seen anything change. and then it all gets caught up in, almost what to me seem like red herring issues, like, whether palm oil is sustainably produced in Malaysia, or whether there's, health concerns if you eat lots of straight palm oil. Those kind of issues. It seems to all get wrapped up in this confusing bundle of issues, and leave a lot of people kind of confused, and some people, I think, especially in the dairy industry, are rather upset by how this is being, I guess, discussed in the public.
I think they're cumulative issues, and that's what I've scratched my head loud. Why this issue? And I think there's several factors, and I think they've come together to create a groundswell, I guess, or a large enough amount of people with concern that it's become a big issue. You have the palm oil environmental concern is an overarching. I certainly hear that from people. Way more than I thought I'd hear that as an issue from people, because the use of palm fat is actually a byproduct. So if dairy farmers quit using it, that wouldn't necessarily mean less palm oil, because it's a byproduct from other people's use of palm oil. And then you've got the how attached people are to butter now. Butter sales grew 12% last year. So people have re-engaged with their butter. You look at the butter label, it's cream and maybe salt. So it's a very simple product. So I think there's something to do with that. And then, people want things they can hold on to and trust during the pandemic. And I think this feels like to some people, like something they didn't know that they don't necessarily like. So and then it's dairy, and there's been certain personalities that have driven the public, how far it's gone in the media and the public as well. So there's that factor too. So several factors that have surprisingly come together to make this such a big issue.
And one thing that's kind of popped up in my mind, and I put out a couple questions about it, was, if something does change with the consistency of butter, which is like a basic staple product that we have in every grocery store, who's responsible for monitoring that? This isn't a health concern as far as we know. It's not like a quality in terms of, not being usable or good, but if something changes in the consistency, like hardness versus softness at room temperature, like is somebody in charge of monitoring that or knowing that, or is that something that just right now, I guess every processor, marketer, grocery store is sort of responsible for following up on their own products? Do you know where that kind of responsibility lies?
Well, and I think that's why there are still no answers to this. It's because there isn't really. I mean, for any kind of product like this one, the end consumer is the buyer, and will buy or not based on qualities or quality assurance. And then a step back, the processor has to, produce something the consumer wants, and so you think processors would know. So you think it would be on the processor side or the retailer's side, but certainly there's no agency that monitors that. And from what discussions I've had with people, the Dairy Farmers of Canada doesn't really know, and I'm not sure it's their responsibility to know that particularly. Although I think there's discussions about should dairy farmers or dairy farmers organization take more interest in the feed or what goes into dairy cows as far as a risk management perspective. So I know there's discussions going on about that, but you're right. There's really no, and we don't have the answer. There is no one who necessarily monitors certain cooking parameters or stability parameters in food, as long as they're safe and still healthy and meet broad expectations.
Well, it's an interesting and confusing story, and I'm sure we'll keep following along as it develops. So thanks very much today, John, for joining us to talk about this.
No problem. Thanks, Ed.
John Grigg is editor of Farmtario. This is Between the Rows. Where did the stories in your farm newspaper or magazine come from? How did they arise? A lot of readers have probably never thought much about that, but for journalists, coming up with insightful, unique stories is an art. While some stories come from an event, an incident, or an announcement, others are generated from inside the mind and due to the curiosity of the journalist. Often we refer to this as enterprise reporting. So, let's talk to an enterprise reporter. I now welcome to the program Robert Arnason, who is a sometimes host of this show, not on this week, but other weeks, and who is probably the Western Producer Reporter who is best known for enterprise reporting. So welcome to the show, Robert.
Hey, Ed. I'm glad to be here.
So, Robert, you tend to get an idea and then follow it wherever it goes. You've done this for years. To me, that is the definition of enterprise reporting. And I was thinking it would be interesting for the listener to get a sense of why you do this. What is it that inspires you to take on these kind of things that nobody has actually raised except you?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. So I guess before I answer that, maybe we can talk a bit about, how a typical or standard newspaper or media story is structured. I mean, if you look at, say, what's been in the news recently is this story about hard butter, right? You've done several stories about this issue with some Canadians kind of finding that the butter that they have on their counter just remains hard at room temperature. And of course, there's been incredible amount of media attention on this issue. And so a lot of the stories are kind of like similar, A reporter would talk to a consumer who has experienced this situation in their own household, or maybe several consumers. And then you go to an official group like the Dairy Farmers of Canada or another association or perhaps a farmer, and you say, okay, well, what do you think? And then the story sort of falls into what you might call sort of like a he said, she said format, where you provide, point and counterpoint, and then some sort of context to sort of wrap up the story. So if you look across, radio, TV, print journalism, whatever, a lot of stories sort of fall under that category or that sort of description or format. Guess with an enterprise story, and I don't claim to be an expert in enterprise journalism, I just enjoy doing it. It's more a case of an individual journalist would come up with an idea and say, I've kind of noticed this phenomenon going on in the world. Maybe I should look into this in more detail. So just for the sake of an example, one thing I think about a bit is, okay, rural Canada, small towns, the population is shrinking, and, some of these communities are kind of slowly dying. Enterprise journalists might say, I wonder if it's possible to actually repopulate these communities. What would that look like? Could it be done? How would it work? And then, of course, you'd have to find the right people to talk to kind of look into this issue in some detail. And then that would produce, probably a lengthy article or multiple stories kind of exploring this issue of, could we actually, get more people to live in rural parts of Canada? And do we actually want to do that, and, kind of why?
So recently, 2 weeks in a row, actually, and, our newspaper, the Western Producer, has run these right off the front page with kind of a good splash, which is, I think, how a newspaper should treat its sort of special content. You have taken on two interesting issues. You've looked at two questions that have popped into your mind, and you've gone down the rabbit hole with these things. One is about canola innovation in Canada apparently slipping, that it's not keeping up like you might expect it with Canada's predominance in the production of the crop, and you look at why that is, what's going on and why. And then another one you looked at just this week, which will be next week by the time our listeners hear this, is a lot of hog producers across Western Canada feeling that the producer base is being undermined by the biggest packer, Maple Leaf Foods, failing to update its pricing formula system or its pricing structure to represent cutout values, which is generally seen as a more fair way of pricing a pig, so that the farmer can eke out a profit enough of the time to stay in business, which has been a problem in this industry for years, where that's really not happening. So these are two very different ideas that you've come up with recently, and you've gone down the rabbit hole with both. Can you tell us a bit about how you came up with these ideas and how you decided to follow them?
So I can talk about the canola innovation one in a little bit more detail. So, as you do and I do and most agricultural journalists and journalists in general we get a lot of emails, and we get emails from companies, organizations, governments, trying to tell their side of the story or promote their products. And I was noticing, I guess throughout 2020, in the last couple of years, that I was getting more emails from U.S.-based companies who were kind of like doing interesting things in the canola space. So just an example, there's a company in Massachusetts, near the Boston area, called Yield 10 Bioscience, and they send me press release and send it to others about things they're doing with canola and camelina that are kind of interesting. For example, trying to increase the seed size of these crops. Also, the Yield 10 Bioscience has developed something interesting with camelina in terms of like camelina and bioplastic. So the whole thing got me thinking, why is it that I'm getting these press releases from American companies who are studying canola or trying to, produce innovations in canola, but nothing from Canadian firms? Which led to the basic question of, are there Canadian companies, small Canadian companies, who are trying to find, new traits for canola or new uses for canola? And if these companies don't exist, or there's just a few of them, why is that? What's the problem here in Canada? Why haven't we been able to, push the crop forward, or maybe develop new biopesticides for canola, or whatever it might be? But the point is, there just seemed to be a lack of Canadian companies and scientists and entrepreneurs kind of working in this space. And so I just wanted to find out why. So I talked to some people who, formerly worked for Corteva, and talked to some other people who know about venture capital, and some people who, work in the canola industry, to kind of get their sense of what's the problem and what is kind of holding back innovation. And so I guess what I enjoyed about the whole process is that, it kind of leads to unexpected areas you never really thought about. And people tell you things like, well, Canada has not just a canola innovation problem, we have an innovation problem, period, right? We just don't succeed in that area compared to other countries. And so that, I guess for me as a journalist, I just enjoy that process of kind of accidentally discovering something new or something I didn't really think about or didn't expect at the beginning of the story. And, it is also a good experience because it forces you to kind of reach out and talk to somebody other than kind of the usual suspects. We, as reporters, we kind of fall into the habit of always going back to the same sources over and over again. And so that is also useful because it helps you, provide to the reader a different or new perspective on an issue. The story on pig pricing was a little bit different. Actually, it was kind of came out of not me. It was a hog farmer in Manitoba who just called me up out of the blue last summer, and he wanted to talk just about how pig prices or hog prices were extremely low, and it was becoming ridiculously difficult to survive as an independent hog producer in Western Canada. And he just wanted somebody to kind of look into this issue in some detail and kind of explain why it is that pig prices have become consistently below the cost of production, and what this means kind of for the broader industry and especially independent producers in Western Canada. So really, that story wasn't my idea. It was more like somebody reached out to me. They wanted somebody to kind of look into this, and that's how that happened.
So it was a question that, or a point that led to you having a question that you then followed.
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. You know what strikes me with these things, and I know our older readers, listeners, and viewers would probably understand that because they're raised in an era of everybody reading newspapers all the time, often multiple newspapers. You read your local paper, you read the local city paper, you read one, two, three, four, five farm papers, depending on the farmer out there. But it's been a couple generations since that. Most people have gone down to reading one or two newspapers these days. I guess people really focus on a lot of times specialized publications like our agricultural publications. Farmers are going to read those. They might not get all the city papers they used to get in the old days. So people aren't quite as immersed in the culture of newspaper journalism as they used to. And I kind of think in a way that these enterprise reporting really shows what the print media can bring that other media don't. Like, I was thinking that print media obviously can't be immediate on an issue like social media can, where things are up in 30 seconds if they happen. Even radio stuff is on in minutes if something big happens. We can't fill a big screen TV in your living room with arresting images like TV news can. Even if our stuff on screen, we have websites and video on the website, but it tends to be on a computer screen or on a mobile. It doesn't have that same ability to occupy your life. But I guess through newspapers, we do have the ability to, because we have space, within these big newspapers, to dig down into an issue and to get into something which may not interest everybody, but which would really interest some and be worth a deep dive. And it strikes me that this is one place where print has a permanent future, is in being able to dig down deep and to provide an insight into things that might just never make it on the 6 o'clock news or on a little radio broadcaster in social media where there's just no room for it. I take it you would probably have to alter your approach a lot if you were doing this for any other medium as a prime outlet.
Yeah, I mean, we all journalists kind of get caught in the trap of you kind of feel like you have to follow a certain story. Obviously in the case of the hard butter story I mentioned earlier, it becomes a big thing. And, if you're not on top of it and keeping up to the recent developments, and you're kind of missing out on a story that's really captivating the public, for this moment, right? But what I find interesting is that, okay, so out of this hard butter story, maybe there's something that could turn into a piece of enterprise journalism that then 6 months from now, it can allow, a newspaper or print journalist to start initiate a new conversation. And so what comes from my mind is, okay, so a lot of people are unhappy with dairy farmers because they're using palm oil. And in some people's mind, palm oil, is not great for the planet because it's associated with deforestation, habitat loss in places like Malaysia or Indonesia. It affects, wild animals like orangutans that we have, connections to emotionally. And so then it goes through my mind, okay, so if palm oil has this negative connotation or image, what does that mean for canola going forward? Does canola have a positive global image? Can we increase that reputation it has globally, that it is seen as something that is sustainable and environmentally friendly? And maybe in the longer term, we could really take advantage of that, as Canadians and as an industry, to sort of sell more canola, promote canola oil as sort of environmentally friendly product. And that gives Canada and canola growers competitive advantage, long term in the global marketplace, if you can kind of demonstrate that canola is, much better for the planet than palm oil. So that's what I think is kind of the opportunity for print, is you can kind of put these ideas out there. Sometimes they don't stick. They don't really take off. But sometimes they do. Sometimes you can be part of leading a conversation about, an important topic or a new opportunity for the ag industry, right? And I guess that's the part I enjoy. And personally, I just sort of enjoy the process, right? Asking these questions, talking to some different or unique people with expertise in a certain specific area, and going from there. So
Yeah, so I guess, as always at the end of it, our role in the end is trying to dig up some part of the truth that other people maybe don't know about, and maybe we don't know about when we start digging. But by looking at these questions, we can find a bit more about the world we're in than we started with.
Yeah, and I guess it comes down to the question of time, right? I mean, if you're a TV reporter and you have to produce something by 5 o'clock to go on the 6 o'clock news, right? You just don't have that luxury of time to spend 2 weeks or 3 weeks working on the same story, right? It's just not, part of your job description, really. Whereas in print, we do work on our day-to-day stories that go on the web or go on the paper sort of thing, but we also have that opportunity to kind of as we say, do these deep dives into something which is a little more, I guess, detailed, right? So.
Well, it's fascinating stuff. And Robert, thank you very much for joining me to talk about this, because you're the guy that I think of when I think of somebody who really focuses on enterprise reporting. So it's something our readers should be looking out for. And if they're not aware of it, go look for some of these things, because you wouldn't know of these stories if you weren't reading our publication. So thanks again, Robert, for coming on the show.
Thanks, Ed. Glad to be part of it.
Robert Arnason is a reporter with the Western Producer, and this is Between the Rows. This winter is almost over, especially in the more temperate and less insanely extreme parts of the Northern Hemisphere. In a month, we'll start talking about seeding and planting. But what do these last weeks of the winter market hold for us? To get caught up on the markets and where they're going, I'm joined by Phil Franz Workington of Markets Farm. Hello, Phil, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Ed. Thanks for having me.
Well, here we are. Seeding time isn't too far away, but we're still in the last weeks here of the traditional winter market. How are things looking, and how are you looking at it?
Yeah, it's everything is very strong right now, I guess would be one way to put it. The canola futures last week hit record highs of records in history, price highs. They've since come off of that with some profit taking, but that said, prices are still, were it not for last week's records, the prices they're at now would be their own records. So canola prices are very high. The most other grains and oilseeds are also seeing a fair bit of strength right now. So it's coming into the end of the winter season with a lot of strength in most commodities right now.
Yeah, this is a heck of a better end of the winter than a lot of years we've had here on the Western Canadian prairies. Yeah. So I guess as we go along, what are the big factors out there? We've got obviously canola and everything else strong, carrying through. How do you look at that, and what are the dynamics, I guess, you're watching now as we roll into the Northern Hemisphere pre-season?
Yeah, well, the story on canola is that the strength is tied to concerns over tight supplies. So exports have been very strong. The domestic crush is very strong. So supplies are dwindling, and that story is not going away. That there's talk that the buying interest is backing away a bit, but there's still previous commitments that need to be filled. So there's that's a supportive influence overall. But the other thing to watch right now is South American weather. Right now we're it's still, spring is not too far away, but it's still winter up here. But down there, they're in the middle of their harvest in Brazil, and soybean harvest, and as they harvest the soybeans, they plant corn, and so that is kind of being an influence on markets right now. Brazil's expected to have a record large soybean crop, but wet weather has caused delays, so that's lent a bit of support to soybeans in the U.S., and any support there spills over into our canola market. But yeah, at the end of the day, they're still expected to have a pretty big soybean crop, I think a record large soybean crop. So that's a bearish influence in the background for oilseed markets, at least.
And what, I guess right now, what are you looking for in terms of the Northern Hemisphere, in terms of weather or what our prospects are for the new crop?
Yeah, well, it's looking, I guess, on the drier side for Canadian prairies, at least. Hasn't been too much snow cover in most areas this year, and it's looking on the drier side heading into the spring. So that will should allow for good spring seeding, although that's still a couple months away. But at the same time, moisture reserves are looking low in some areas, so that'll definitely be something to watch, and we'll need some timely rains, or there's still time for a dump of snow before all is said and done, but nearby forecasts aren't pointing to that. So we'll watching the weather on the dryness, or if we get some moisture, will be something to keep an eye on.
Well, I got to say, it has been quite the winter. The rally, I think, took everybody by surprise, especially the way we were midsummer last year. The strength from August on has been astounding, and it's, I guess, if we think of ourselves, I guess when we think of our readers and listeners who are feeders of livestock, maybe it's not such a happy time with these inflated prices. But I guess for most of our readers who are crop growers, this has been really quite a remarkably good and happy winter in terms of the markets.
Yeah, if you have barley to sell, it's you're looking at some pretty high prices. But buying barley, on the other hand, is a different story.
Yeah, I just wish I had a few bins of something, a few bins of something unpriced. So
yeah, anyone with unpriced anything right now is sitting on profits, it seems. So how long that'll last, I don't know if I'd recommend holding out too long, because what goes up eventually comes down. But for now, it's still the trend is still up on most things.
Well, Phil, thank you for the update. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Phil Franz Workington is with Glacier Markets Farm, and this is Between the Rows. That's all for this week. Be sure to catch our next edition next week. I'm Ed White, and it was my pleasure being your host.
Your soil has a unique story. At Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, we get that. Start using precise nutrient information to get optimal crop performance. Try our variable rate program risk-free today. Visit decisivefarming.com. Conditions apply.